Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today we're going to talk about this paper called Gender Differences in Grading, Teacher Bias or Student Behavior. And so this paper talks about the fact that teachers, they tend to grade boys more harshly than they grade girls. And this constitutes a bias. And the way that we know that is if you take a student evaluation, so like an exam or assignment, and you have teachers grade it, but the teachers know the gender of the students, they give lower scores to the boys on average. But if you take a student evaluation that's anonymous, so an exam or assignment where the teacher is blinded to the gender of the students, boys are graded more favorably than they previously were. And so there seems to be some sort of bias, a gender-based bias against boys in schooling. And so this paper, it gives an overview of the literature on that, and then they offer their own analysis and their own potential explanation for why this is the case. So they take the approach that it's not necessarily a bias on the part of the teachers, but it's that the male students, they're behaving in a way that basically makes the teachers not like them as much and then subconsciously give them a lower grade. I'm not sure that that's true, but we'll talk about that as we get into it. So the reason this paper matters is because boys are doing worse in school as time goes on. So obviously there used to be asymmetrical education where boys would attain more and they would go on to college at higher rates, go on to professional school and graduate school at higher rates, and they would have higher educational attainment. Well, that seems to be sort of flipping today, and there's a lot of potential explanations for that. There's a lot of affirmative action, a pro-woman affirmative action. Academia is increasingly hostile to males, so you have to do, speaking from experience, whenever I was in graduate school, we had to do like training modules about toxic masculinity and stuff like that. There's nothing equivalent for females. So it's a very unpleasant atmosphere for males to be, and I think that's kind of pushing them out of it. Um, it's also sort of increasingly feminine in the sense that you're not allowed to be competitive. You're not allowed to be politically incorrect or make jokes. And these are all things that males like to do. They like to be edgy. They like to take risks. These things are increasingly discouraged in academic areas. So it's no wonder that males find it unpleasant. So there's a lot of potential explanations, but the reason this is a problem is because as more and more women go on to higher education and fewer men do, it's going to shift the power balance in society in a pro-female way. And this is dangerous because women are very liberal, and liberalism is frankly destroying the society by every metric. Okay, you take any liberal issue, for the most part, it's destructive to civilization. So, okay, they're pro-immigration, they're pro-abortion, they're pro-contraceptives, everything that's lowering the fertility rate, everything that's promoting cultural conflict. Pretty much all of it stems from liberalism, and it's the most liberal women who are going on to higher education because they don't want families. They're instead going to spend their lives trying to become like a famous academic or intellectual or something. So we don't want to see that power shift away from men and toward women. Women are also more likely to censor academic topics that they disagree with. They're more likely to enforce the status quo. They support political correctness. They're pro-diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're pro-affirmative action. They're anti-meritocracy. Obviously, I'm speaking in generalities, but when you're talking about millions of people, averages matter a lot. So again, we don't want to see males get basically barred from higher education and to become dominated by females, because like anything else that females dominate, that'll make it very liberal, which will make it very destructive to our population. Okay, so we need to correct this. Okay, because obviously if boys, even early on in their education, so we're talking, this study and most studies like this are talking about like grade school and high school. If boys are going to be graded more harshly, they're going to have less likelihood of getting good scholarships or getting into college or even wanting to go to college because it destroys their motivation. And so again, it's going to basically tank males' success. You have the other issue. If males aren't going to college and they can't find high-paying jobs, well, then they're not going to be able to get married because, financial security is one of the main things women are looking for. So if the man doesn't go to college because he got discouraged early on in school because he was graded more harshly, then you can't get a good job, you can't get a wife, you can't have kids, and then that's going to contribute to the fertility crisis. So we need to correct this. So now we'll get into the background and talk about some of the previous studies on this topic. So in the introduction, they say, one, teachers' evaluations is not just about the cognitive abilities of the students. They say teachers, they consider other things mostly subconsciously whenever they're assigning grades to the students. So they say that teachers conflate student cognitive performance with non-cognitive factors such as student effort, engagement, and class behavior. So one of the things this author argues is that because males, their behavior he considers problematic because they have more attention problems and things like that. Teachers may take that into account when assigning them grades and therefore give them lower grades. And even if the male is like equivalent in intelligence to his female peer, he'll be graded more harshly than her. Okay. But the reason this is a problem again is because he says here, previous research has established the direct influence of teachers' grading behavior on student motivation, self-confidence, and effort. Okay, so it's like a feedback cycle. Whenever a student is graded more harshly, they get less motivated, they get less self-confidence, they devote less effort in the future. And with all this, they're going to have behavioral problems. They're not going to want to sit there and do school when they think they're bad at school. And then teachers are going to see all that. And they're going to assume that this means the child isn't as intelligent, which means they're going to give them lower grades. And then it's a self-amplifying positive feedback cycle. So again, very important that we eliminate biased grading. So he says that what he does here in this study, and we'll talk about it more in a minute, he says he compares school grades marked by teachers and national exams marked blindly. So in other words, school grades, the teachers knew the student and therefore knew the gender of who they were grading. So this is considered like the grading potentially susceptible to bias. But then he also compares that to national exams the students took, which are marked blindly without knowledge of gender. So this is considered an unbiased exam. So if, for example, you have a particular student, let's say a girl, and she has a really good school grade, but she doesn't do very well on the national exam, that might be a bias, a gender-related bias in her school grading. Conversely, if you have a boy and his school grade is poor, but he does really well on the national exam, that might represent a negative bias in his school grade, an anti-male bias by the teacher. Okay, so we'll see what he finds, and then we'll talk about why he thinks he found that. Okay, so he says here, he gives an overview of some of the previous studies. He says, contrary to the general belief that teachers may be biased against female students, most of the studies have found that the gender gap is against male students. Okay, so in other words, if you were to ask some random person, most people would be under the impression that teachers are biased against female students. And that's probably because, at least for my entire life, we've been told that our society is patriarchal and that it's anti-female and that it's harsher on women and more difficult for women. Of course, I don't think that's true at all. I think it's the opposite, because even if that was the case at one point in our country's history, it's certainly not the case anymore, because we've more than overcorrected to where now there's mountains of pro-female affirmative action. There's female-specific scholarships, female-specific grants in graduate school and things like that. So there's no equivalent for males. So it's certainly not a pro-male bias in academia. I think that's absurd. So again, he says, most of the studies have found that the gender gap is against male students. He says, teachers' pro-female bias has been documented in several countries in educational contexts, including the Czech Republic, France, Israel, Italy, Norway, and the United States. Okay, so it's all throughout Europe as well as Israel. And this particular study that we're looking at, it was conducted in Chile, so also in South America. Okay, so it seems to be relatively universal. Although most of these societies, so for example, Europe and America, are increasingly like female-centric. In other words, they're very, very feminist. They're very anti-male in the way that they're structured, in the way that they're restructuring themselves. So I wonder what that has to do with it. I mean, you got to keep in mind, all of these teachers who are teaching like elementary school and things like that, they go to school for education where they're basically taught everything extremely left-wing. They're taught all the diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff. They're taught feminism. They're taught that women are victims and that men are excessively privileged and things like that. And so it's almost certainly the case that they're taking this back with them whenever they go and become teachers, and they're having a pro-female and anti-male bias in part because of what they're taught in college. So in terms of solving this problem, one of the things is we have to go after our colleges that are giving education degrees. And we need to make them aware of the anti-male bias that exists in grading, and we need to take steps to correct that. Okay? No, we can't allow pro-woman and anti-male propaganda in colleges anymore. Okay. So we go down and he starts talking about, he gives an overview of his results. He says, consistent with the literature, I find that boys get lower grades than girls when they are assessed by their teachers compared to their scores on the national exams in both Spanish and math. So again, remember this is conducted in Chile. So you can basically just take this to mean in language subjects and in math subjects. He says, this suggests there is a grading gap and this runs against boys. The grading gap against boys remains unchanged by school type, rural or urban schools, school size, and geographical location. In addition, I provide evidence that this grading gap holds for all the grades examined, so like all years of schooling. He does say, moreover, it presents a clear pattern. This is, again, the gender gap against males, the bias against males. It increases from 4th grade to 8th grade before falling to the transition to 10th grade. Okay? So late elementary school is where the bias against males is the highest. He says, I also show that the grading gap against boys is present throughout the entire ability distribution. So in other words, at both the lowest performing students, there's bias against males, and of the highest performing students, there's bias against males. We'll see that more when we get to the results. Okay, and then he starts to look at the mechanism or the explanation for why this is the case. He says, he provides evidence on the mechanisms that helps understand the grading gap against boys. Okay, so what he finds is, he says, I find that female students experience higher, more positive returns to behavioral variables than male students. Girls exert more effort than boys, and part is due to girls being rewarded more for a given amount of effort. I.e., even if boys put in the same effort as girls, they would not get the same school grade. So now he goes on to look at previous studies and what they suggest might be the explanation for this. So the first previous study that he talks about basically suggested that maybe teachers, they have an expectation and they're biased in that respect. So like they might expect girls to do better on language related tasks, and so then they have a pro-girl bias in their grading. But he says that regardless of the relative performance of boys and girls in a school, the bias is always against boys. So in other words, if you have a subject where girls are expected to do better and where they usually do better, like language, the bias is in favor of girls and against boys. But even if you have a subject where boys are expected to do better and usually do better, like math, the bias is still against boys and in favor of girls. Okay, so it's not expectation by the teacher. He says, previous research emphasizes the role of teachers exploring the relationship between gender bias and teachers' characteristics. So this was my initial thought whenever I started reading this paper, which is that, well, most teachers are female, and there's probably a bias in favor of their same gender. Okay, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And he looks at that in this paper too, and I looked into this other study, and it doesn't seem to be related to the gender of the teacher or the age of the teacher or any real obvious teacher characteristic. Okay, so it's not really the teacher and their characteristics that are influencing this. Okay, he says, several studies have shown that women are less effective compared to men in competitive environments. Okay, so women don't do as well in a competition as men do. When there's a competition involved, men, they raise their performance. Women tend to get timid and they don't raise their performance or they perform worse. So he says maybe what's happening is boys outperform girls in high stakes tests. So like national exams, they're high stakes. So maybe that sort of invigorates the competitive nature of boys, and that makes them perform better than they previously were in the classroom. Okay, I think there could definitely be something to this. In school, students are increasingly discouraged from being competitive with each other, and they're instead being instilled with the mindset that sort of like everybody's a winner. It doesn't really matter how you do. Just like try your hardest. There's no hierarchy to it among the students, which is what males really like. So young boys, they want to, rise to the top of a hierarchy. They want to outperform their peers. But, if you're discouraged from looking at school through a competitive lens, then they're not going to find it as appealing. So that's another thing that could be changed if we want to, get boys excited about school again. Make it more of a competition. Okay, so he also says here, finally, it's conceivable that differences in student behavior explain differences in teachers' evaluations. Okay, that's the hypothesis that this author favors. So he says, it's well established that boys tend to have more behavioral and attention problems, less self-regulation, and less self-discipline. Okay, I think, well, that's definitely true, but I think you have to look at why that's the case. So again, I think it's because we're turning education into something that's very anti-masculine. Okay, think about what boys want to do. Again, they want to be competitive with each other. Not really allowed to do that in school. They want to take risks and push themselves and do something dangerous to show bravery. You're not allowed to do that in school because it's structured to be an extremely safe place for them, because they have to basically eliminate all sort of danger, all sort of threats. So boys don't like that. They're not allowed to be physical. So boys are obviously more physical than girls. They want to be out playing. They want to be developing physical abilities and skills. But in school, they're expected to just sit there all day. Okay. Girls, they want to please their peers and their higher ups on the hierarchy. So like their teachers or their parents. They're very social creatures. So they're more willing to do what's necessary to get compliments and favorable perception by their peers. Okay, boys, they don't really care about the social aspect as much. Again, they're mostly interested in like real world practicality. And I'm a college teacher, and I see this all the time with my male students. They don't perform very well if you just ask them to memorize something that has no relevance to their life. It's not because they can't memorize it, it's just they don't care, so they don't do it. Okay, the girls will do it because they want to be perceived as intelligent. Okay, the boys don't really care how they're viewed. But if you start giving them information that's applicable to their real lives, they'll remember it even if you don't ask them to. They don't want to memorize, regurgitate, and get rewarded with a good grade. They want to fix some serious problem in the world or in their lives. I think that if school was more hands-on, boys would do better. All right, so one thing they say is that even though boys are said to have like more emotional and behavioral problems, a major drawback there is that a lot of those studies rely on teachers assessing the students, and if the teachers are biased against males, maybe their bias is causing them to rate males as having more behavioral problems. Okay? But anyways, my point was, if school is an environment that boys don't want to be in, of course they're not going to behave themselves. Okay? They're not going to pay attention to irrelevant information. Okay? They want to do something important. So with this paper, he looked at data from Chile, like I said, and he looked at many different schools across Chile at many different grade levels, as we'll see. And all you really need to know is that there's basically this national exam that's graded blindly without respect to gender. And he compares that to grades that students receive in a class where their gender is known during grading. Okay, so that's the method that he uses to determine bias. Okay, so we could skip down to the results. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at is this table 2. The first table's not really relevant to us. It's just talking about which years data were available in these different data sources that he used. So with table 2, what they look at is the different grades. So we have 4th grade, 6th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade of these students. Within each of those, they have the female performance and the male performance in both Spanish and math. And then within each subject, they have their performance both in school grades, which was graded with the gender known, so that the teacher obviously knows the student and knows their gender, versus the national exam, which this SIMCE, that's just a national exam in Chile, and it's graded blindly, so the gender is not known at the time of grading. Okay, and the actual numbers here are not overly important. That's basically standard deviations away from the mean. So a value of 0 would mean they're exactly at the mean. A value above that means they scored higher than the mean. And a value below that means they scored lower than the mean. Okay, so like let's take Spanish school grades. Females, their value here is 0.136. Males is negative 0.134. So what that's telling you is that the females received higher school grades than the males. Okay. Now you look at the national exam. Okay, the females, they were 0.094. The males, that's negative 0.092. So the females still perform better than the males, but not by as much of a margin. There's not as much of a difference anymore. So it's a little bit confusing in how they calculate the bias, but basically they take the difference between the females and males for a given type of grade, so school grades. So they do the female score minus the male score, and if that number ends up being positive, that means the females got a higher score than the males. Okay, and then they do the same thing for the national exam. They take the female score minus the male score, and they get the difference. And again, if it's positive, that means the females did better. But then what they do, they take the difference between the difference of the school grade and the difference of the national exam. So they subtract that. And if that, again, the reason for that is that's basically a measure of how much bias there is. And all you really need to know is that if the result of that ends up being a positive number, that means there was a bias favoring females and against males. Okay, so as long as you can understand that if that calculation spits out a positive number, it's a bias favoring females and against males, that's the main point. So now we can look at that for every single category. So let's look at 4th grade Spanish. All right, you do the difference of the differences and you get a positive value, meaning an anti-boy bias in school. You look at 6th grade, the difference of the differences. It's 0.161. That's positive. That's a bias against males. You look at the difference of the differences in 8th grade Spanish. It's positive, a bias against boys. You look at the difference of the differences in 10th grade for Spanish. It's positive, which means a bias against boys. Now you go to math. You look at the difference of the differences for 4th graders in math. It's positive, a bias against boys. There's a positive bias against boys for 6th grade math, positive bias against boys for 8th grade math, and a bias against boys for 10th grade math. So in every single subject they looked at, there was a bias against boys in the school grading. Okay, so now we can move on. This table we're not going to really talk about. This is just talking about the characteristics of their study population. So like how educated were their parents, what's their ethnicity, and things like that. What was their school attendance? We're not super interested in that, so we'll pass by that for now. And we'll skip ahead to this next table, table 4. And what they're looking at here is what factors correlated with bias in these different samples. So what you need to understand this table is that if the number they're talking about is positive, that means there's a bias in favor of that particular row characteristics. Okay, so what's interesting is if you look down here at like parents' education, so let's look at father's education. The parents who are more educated, there was actually like a negative bias to those children in every single subject. So if the children's parents had higher education, the teachers were basically biased against those children. Similar results were observed with income. Higher income families, the teachers were more biased against those children during grading. And these ones are also interesting. So if they were from a minority ethnic group, or if they were a foreign student, the teachers were biased toward them. So they graded them more leniently if they were a minority or if they were foreign. So that's another important point, although it strays a little bit from the point of the paper. But even minorities are being graded more generously. So we can skip ahead to this next figure, which is showing the gender grading gap across different ages. Okay, so basically the y-axis position in this is just how much of a bias there is against boys at that particular age level and by year. So like in 2011, there was a relatively low anti-male bias. Okay, that anti-male bias increased over time for the 4th graders. If you look at 6th graders, there's a much higher anti-male bias. Likewise, at 8th grade, there's a very high anti-male bias, and then it goes down a little bit in 10th grade. Okay, and this, I believe, panel A is talking about language, And panel B is talking about math again, but it's the same basic trend, okay? Anti-male bias that peaks around 6th and 8th grade in these samples. Okay, what these next figures are showing is the ability of the students. So basically, how do they perform by that subject? So again, this first panel is in language subjects. So even among the lowest performing students over here on the left side of the graph, there is a grading bias favoring females, which is what the red line is showing, versus boys, which is the black line. Okay, so you can see there's a consistent grading bias that actually increases a little bit as the student's ability increases. So like over here on the right side, these are the really smart girls and the really smart boys. And the greater the intelligence of the students, the more teachers are biased against boys in the case of language. Okay, in the case of math down here, it's basically the same at each ability range. So even among the most intelligent students in the class, there's a pro-female anti-male bias, but it's not any bigger than the pro-female anti-male bias down at the lowest end of the ability spectrum. Okay. So the main point of those two graphs is just that teachers have an anti-male bias at all levels of ability among their students. Okay, table 5 just shows the same thing in table form. All right, and now we'll look down at the mechanism. So again, they say there may be a gender effort gap. Again, I think boys are kind of unimpressed and unhappy with school, so they don't really try that hard. But then whenever the really important tests come along, they do try and they do well. So effort might be an explanation. His explanation is more about the student's behavior. So we're going to skip down a lot through this because it gets unnecessarily technical. We're just going to go right to the statement of the results. But they do a lot of testing and studies to say that the gender gap in grading doesn't substantially correlate with teacher's identity. So in other words, it's not so much the teacher's characteristics, not the teacher's gender that's influencing it or things like that. They say, in turn, it tends to be the class characteristics. So it's the nature of the class that's being assessed as the key to understand the mechanism behind the gender gap in grading. Okay, so maybe the particular class has a unruly set of boys, and that's causing the teacher to be upset, which is causing them to grade them more harshly. That could be one potential explanation. So again, it says, boys tend to have more behavioral and attention problems. I don't necessarily like the way he characterizes this as a problem. I think that boys, they have a specific developmental pathway that prioritizes, physicality in their play, roughness, competitiveness, risk-taking, danger, things like that. Basically everything that's discouraged in a school setting. And attention problems. Again, I don't think it's an attention problem. I think it's that they don't see how the information they're learning is important. Again, trying to get a student to understand something like a complex mathematical concept or a complex science concept, if they don't understand like how they can use it to change the world around them, they really don't latch on to that information. Then they don't care about it, so they don't pay attention. Girls, on the other hand, again, they can latch onto that information because latching onto that information for them is necessary to do well in the next test, which is necessary to get social favor from their parents or their teachers or their friends. So because girls are more about the sociality of it all, they can pay attention to something completely irrelevant. Whereas boys, they can't pay attention to something that's completely irrelevant because they're all concerned about actually applying what they know to change the world around them. So if you don't teach boys why what they're learning matters, they're not going to learn it. So again, I don't think it's an attention problem and a behavioral problem. I think it's the nature of the way we have school structured. It's hostile to masculinity and very favorable to femininity. Okay. They show down here at table 9 that girls are more likely to do their homework than boys. Girls are more likely to say that they enjoy studying than boys. And that basically suggests that males, they're just not that interested in school. And that difference, that gap, increases over time. So when they're young, they're basically the same. Girls and boys are both enthusiastic about school, well, relatively speaking. But then as time progresses, they become increasingly unhappy with it and increasingly they don't really care about it. Part of that might be because there's biased grading against them, and so they're being graded harshly and they're convinced that they're not good at school, so then they stop caring about it. That could be one explanation. Okay, but the author takes this to mean that there's a behavioral problem in males, and that's why they don't do as well. Because the teachers pick up on these behavioral abnormalities, maybe they see it as a sign of disrespect or frustration, and they grade them more harshly as a consequence. But it's sort of a chicken or the egg problem, because as we saw earlier, harsh grading, that just diminishes students' motivation and effort. Okay, so which came first, the boys' behavioral problems or the biased grading? The study doesn't really address that. Okay, so the last thing they say that we're going to look at in this paper is down at the bottom, they say, basically regarding all of their evidence that they've compiled, this encourages the design of policies aimed at improving boys' non-cognitive skills. By that, he means their behavior and their attention and focus and things like that, and thus closing the gender gaps presented in this paper. Well, that's one potential solution, but I think this is sort of a telling mindset that the author has, because in papers where they talk about girls doing worse in school or in the workforce by some metric, it's always, we need to change the workforce or the school to be more accommodating to them. So, like, for example, I read a paper once, maybe we can cover it on this channel, where women weren't doing as well in STEM because they were very competitive fields and women didn't like competition as much. They voluntarily weren't entering as much. And so the authors proposed more affirmative action to support females getting in. Okay, but this author says here, it's not the schools that's the problem. It's not the teachers that's the problem. It's the boys that are the problem. I don't think so. I think that boys are just developing naturally, and I think they don't see the relevance of what they're learning, and I think they want to be doing other things other than what they do at school. So, like I said, school has become very soft. It's become very cushy and coddled, and boys don't like to be in that environment. They like to be out challenging themselves, testing their limits, exploring, triumphing over danger and risk. And they want to be doing things that help them feel brave and make them feel strong and stuff like that. None of that's really allowed in school. They're basically just forced to sit there all day and be told what to do, which of course boys do not want to do that. And again, we shouldn't want to change boys. We should want them to pursue power and to want to be in charge and to not want to just sit there and be told what to do. Those are admirable traits. So maybe what we need to do is actually have like gender segregated school lessons to a greater extent. So maybe for several hours every day, the boys and girls get split up and the girls get taught, things related to girlhood, like maybe family rearing and stuff like that, and cooking, whereas boys are taught more masculine traits and virtues. Okay, I think they should be taught like how to fight in school. I think they should be taught how to use weapons in school, like how to use a firearm in school. I think that they should be taught basic survival skills, almost like Boy Scouts, but associated with the school. And I think they should be taught more practical skills, hands-on activities. I think they would like that a lot better. And you would see them actually pay attention and absorb that information very, very quickly. Like I said before, they also need to be taught something that they see the real world relevance to, because again, girls are fine to just learn something irrelevant for the sake of bolstering their social standing. Boys, they don't want to learn something irrelevant. They want to learn something that they can actually use to shape the world around them. And so as far as that goes, I think we need to teach the controversy, maybe specifically to boys. So there's a lot of controversial academic topics, including, for example, this one. And I think that boys, whenever they see an ideological battle taking place, they get really excited about that, because boys, of course, like to compete. They like to fight. They like to argue. Okay, and that's all like status climbing behavior for boys. They want to beat their opponents and rise to the top. So I think if you teach boys the existence of controversial subjects, I think boys are really going to gravitate to those topics, and they're going to love it a lot more. And you'd be surprised how quickly they absorb that information. So, no, I don't think the answer is change the nature of boys. I think the answer is to change the nature of schooling. And even though this author doesn't really think it has to do with the teachers, we do need to change educational institutions. All right. New teachers should not be indoctrinated with feminism and diversity propaganda and things like that in their own colleges, because then they're going to take it back to their classroom and they're subconsciously going to be biased against boys and in favor of girls. And that's going to create a lot of societal problems, as we talked about at the beginning of the video. But that's pretty much it. That's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. So like I said, we need to correct this issue if we're going to see men enter higher education more frequently and get some of those important jobs. And ultimately, that's important because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the gender war is really just a proxy war for the political war. In other words, males are by far more conservative, females are by far more liberal. What we need is young right-wing men entering academia. And in order to do that, we need to correct any biases in grading that's going to diminish boys' interest in schooling. We also need to change the education system to make school more appealing to boys. So maybe we'll talk about other gender differences in academia in future videos. Thank you for listening.